Before we begin, if you've ever looked into a dog's eyes and felt like they understood everything, if you believe that some connections, once formed, never truly break, then this story will feel like home to you. It's a tale of a little girl with a fragile heart and a lost dog who forgot the world but not her voice. Together, they crossed years of silence, storm, and shadow. If stories like these warm your soul even just a little, give this video a gentle like, and consider subscribing, not just for us, but for the stories still waiting to be told. Stay with us, friend. This one might just stay with you long after it ends. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the crisp scent of snowmelt and the distant hush of an oncoming storm. It was late autumn in the outskirts of Estes Park, Colorado, where the town's wooden porches creaked with memories and the Rockies stood like ancient guardians in the distance. The air was brittle that afternoon, the kind of cold that pricked the skin but didn't yet bite. It was the first Saturday in November, and 9-year-old Lila Whitmore was wandering the wooded edge of the town's national park, chasing pockets of solitude the way other children chased butterflies. Lila wasn't like most children her age. She had the pale, almost translucent complexion of someone who had spent too much time indoors, and her movements were careful, as though each breath was a debt to be repaid. She had been born with a congenital heart defect, one that had stolen many school days and summer camps, but not her spirit. Her dark brown hair, tied back with a faded red ribbon, bobbed gently as she walked. Her eyes, wide and storm-gray, often held the gaze of someone much older than her years. She was curious, observant, and disarmingly gentle. It was during this quiet exploration that she heard the whimper, faint, muffled, but unmistakably animal. She stopped mid-step, tilting her head toward a dense thicket of aspen saplings. There, tangled in brambles and half-hidden beneath a fallen log, was a small German shepherd pup. The dog was no older than 4 months, lean to the point of emaciation. Its fur was a dusky silver-gray, matted with dirt and leaves, and one of its ears had a clean split through the tip. But it wasn't the injuries that caught Lila's attention, it was the eyes. Mismatched in hue, one amber, one clouded blue, they stared at her with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The pup didn't bark or growl. It just watched her, chest heaving, too tired to move. Lila knelt slowly, arms relaxed, voice no louder than a leaf falling. "Hey, it's okay. I won't hurt you." She remembered what her mother had taught her, no sudden movements, avoid direct eye contact, let the animal choose. And after several long minutes of shared stillness, the pup inched forward, trembling. It pressed its wet nose against Lila's knee and then slumped onto her lap with a weary sigh, as if conceding to fate. "I don't think Mom will say yes, but you look like you need someone," she whispered softly, her fingers gently brushing the tangled fur as if offering a promise neither of them yet understood. Sarah Whitmore was a tall woman in her early 40s, with broad shoulders and an expression that often bordered on exhaustion. Years of working as a veterinary trauma specialist had gifted her an encyclopedic knowledge of animal anatomy and a somewhat hardened disposition, especially after losing her husband in a car accident 6 years earlier. Since then, she had raised Lila on her own, balancing night shifts at the local animal clinic with homeschooling and a relentless worry etched deep into her brow. Sarah's face, always so composed, turned from surprise to immediate concern when Lila walked through their back gate cradling the pup like a wounded sibling. "Sweetheart, what in the world?" He was alone. Near the riverbank. "I think he's hurt." Sarah didn't protest further. Instead, her hands went instinctively to work, palpating joints, checking wounds, scanning eyes. She was methodical and firm, but there was a tenderness in the way she held the pup's paw that Lila had only seen her use with the most fragile rescues. "He's dehydrated, malnourished, and scared to death," Sarah said finally. "But he's got a heartbeat like a drum. Strong. Can we keep him?" Lila asked, barely daring to hope. Sarah hesitated, eyes flicking from the pup to her daughter's pale cheeks. "Just until we find the owner, or a proper shelter." But Lila had already named him. "His name is Shadow." "Why Shadow?" "Because he didn't bark. He followed me like one. And, he looks like he's hiding from the world. Sarah pursed her lips, but something softened in her eyes. All right. For now. The days that followed unfolded like threads weaving a quiet bond. Lila would wake early to feed Shadow, her tiny hands steady even as her own heart fluttered unpredictably. She brushed his fur, set out warm blankets, and even sang to him when his dreams turned restless and he whimpered in his sleep. Shadow, for his part, followed Lila with a loyalty that was nearly telepathic. He never strayed far from her room and seemed to sense when her energy dipped, curling beside her on the couch when she was too tired to walk or nudging her hand gently when she was frightened after one of her routine checkups. He learned quickly, too. Within days, he had stopped flinching at loud noises and began responding to Lila's soft commands with quiet understanding. Sarah observed the transformation with silent reverence. Shadow was no longer the frightened shell of a pup she had examined that first night. And Lila, who had been growing increasingly isolated since her latest surgery, now laughed aloud, clear, bell-like sounds that Sarah hadn't heard in months. Still, Sarah remained cautious. She put up flyers, called the nearby shelters, scanned for microchips, nothing. No one claimed the dog. And as the weeks passed, it became increasingly clear that Shadow wasn't missing. He had been left. One evening, as snow began to dust the yard outside and wind howled through the trees like forgotten voices, Lila sat by the fireplace, reading from a picture book about wolves. Shadow rested his chin on her knee, eyes half-lidded, tail gently thumping. Sarah sat on the armrest nearby, sipping lukewarm tea. "Mom?" Lila asked, not looking up from the book. "Do you think he knows I'm sick?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at Shadow's calm, steady presence. "I think he knows you're strong." They sat in silence after that, one forged not by fear or distance, but by quiet comfort. And though Sarah would never say it aloud, in the flickering firelight she saw something she hadn't dared hope for in years, the beginnings of healing. By the time the first true snowfall blanketed the town of Estes Park, the little house at the edge of Evergreen Hollow had changed in subtle, almost invisible ways. The wind no longer sounded quite so hollow through the trees, and the silence in the Whitmore home had begun to hum with a quiet warmth, not from the furnace, but from the presence of something newly alive. Shadow had been there for just over 3 weeks, and though he still flinched at sudden sounds or raised voices, the slow unraveling of fear from his shoulders was undeniable. Lila, pale and frail as a pressed flower but stubborn in spirit, was the architect of his transformation. Each day after her schoolwork and medical checks, she'd sit beside him, sometimes on the kitchen floor, other times by the glass sliding door, and read aloud from books about animals, fairy tales, or simply the weather forecast. Shadow never seemed to mind what she read. He only listened, head resting on her slippered feet, ears twitching gently with her voice. Sarah had been watching all of this in quiet disbelief. After years of managing emergencies in the sterile, fluorescent halls of animal clinics, she had learned to expect setbacks, regressions, and hard lines. But with Lila and Shadow, the usual rules frayed. She had seen the pup go from barely responsive to tail wagging at the sound of Lila's cough. She had watched her daughter, who once spent hours listless under weighted blankets, now rise before sunrise to heat up broth for a dog who once didn't eat. The outdoor space, however, was proving inadequate. Shadow needed somewhere safe, warm, and separate at night, especially with temperatures dropping into the teens. So Sarah, with her practical mind and precise hands, spent a weekend converting the old toolshed in the backyard. She stripped out the rusted garden shelves, patched the leaking roof, added insulation, and, after much debate, cut out a small door with a vinyl flap, leading to a fenced corner of the yard where Shadow could roam freely. The final touch was a thick mattress made from old couch cushions, layered with flannel blankets and a worn-out quilt that used to be Lila's favorite. When the project was complete, Lila stood in the doorway of the shed, eyes wide with awe. "It looks like a little cabin," she whispered. "Like something in the woods where a story begins." Shadow, sniffing cautiously, circled the space once, twice, then curled up without hesitation in the far corner. His mismatched eyes blinked slowly before closing in a long, peaceful sigh. Their rhythms began to solidify. Mornings were for breakfast and medication. Afternoons, for school and slow walks along the frozen trail behind the house. Evenings belonged to the firelight and the sound of Lila's voice drifting through the yard as she read aloud to Shadow, often wrapped in a blanket, her breath rising like smoke in the cold. Sarah sometimes watched from the kitchen window, a strange ache blooming in her chest, equal parts fear and fierce love. One person who noticed the changes from outside the family was Dr. Ken Mora, a pediatric cardiologist in his 50s with sharp features, wire-rimmed glasses, and a voice that rarely rose above a murmur. He had treated Lila since she was 4 and had seen her through 2 surgeries and 1 near-fatal infection. Reserved by nature, Dr. Mora was not known for optimism. But during a December appointment, as he examined her test results, his expression changed for the first time in years. "Her inflammatory markers are down," he said to Sarah, eyebrows lifted. "Appetites returned. Sleep's improved. It's unexpected, given the season." Sarah crossed her arms. "Are you saying it's a coincidence?" "I'm saying it's not strictly medical," Dr. Mora replied. "There are things medicine can't measure. Whatever that dog is doing, it's helping." That week, things took a turn. Lila collapsed while brushing Shadow in the yard. Her lips had turned blue. Sarah didn't wait, she bundled her into the car and drove the icy road to Denver Children's Hospital, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Shadow tried to follow them, barking once, low and sharp, but Sarah ordered him to stay. Lila was admitted immediately. Her oxygen levels were dangerously low. Tests were run. Monitors beeped through the nights. Sarah remained by her side, calling home only to ask a neighbor, Mrs. Delaney, an elderly widow who walked with a cane and smelled of cinnamon, to feed Shadow and check the yard. But something strange began happening. Shadow wouldn't eat. He wouldn't leave the edge of the yard. He didn't bark. He didn't sleep in the shed Sarah had built. Instead, he laid at the sliding door to Lila's room, his head pressed against the cold glass. Neighbors said he only moved to pace the path she used to take from the gate to the porch and back again. When Sarah returned home one evening to gather fresh clothes, she found him there, thin, motionless, eyes dull. She knelt beside him, fingers brushing his coat. "She's okay," she whispered, though her voice broke. "She's fighting." Shadow didn't move. Back at the hospital, something else began to shift. Nurses, seasoned women in pastel scrubs who had seen countless children come and go, started to notice. Lila, despite her condition, was more alert. Her breathing stabilized faster than expected. When shown videos Sarah had taken of Shadow in the yard, Lila's pulse rate calmed. One nurse, a no-nonsense type named Brandy with short curls and a tattoo of a moon behind her ear, said aloud what everyone was thinking. "He's tethered to her. Like, when he hurts, she hurts. When she fights, so does he." On day 12 of Lila's stay, Sarah finally got permission to bring Shadow for a visit. He was freshly bathed, though still thinner than before, and wore a soft blue harness with his name embroidered in white. The moment Lila saw him, ears forward, body stiff with anticipation, she let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Shadow didn't bark or leap. He walked slowly, reverently, to the side of her hospital bed and placed his head gently on her chest. The monitor beside her flickered, heartbeat steady, calm. Lila's fingers sank into the fur between his ears, and she whispered something only he could hear. From that day forward, he was allowed to visit twice a week. Staff bent rules. Brandy smuggled in dog treats. Even Dr. Mora, who rarely smiled, allowed himself a quiet nod each time Shadow entered the ward. Lila began improving, slowly, but with a strength that could not be explained in dosages or lab values. Winter pressed deeper into Colorado, snow thickening on rooftops, the wind sharper. But inside the Whitmore home, and in that hospital room, something warm had begun to take root. Shadow, once a frightened stray, now stood guard not just over a house, but over a heart learning to beat with courage again. By the time Lila turned 11, the long Colorado winter had begun to loosen its grip. Snow still lingered in shaded hollows and the mountains remained draped in white, but in the valleys, crocuses pushed up through thawing earth, and birds returned to the trees like cautious messengers of spring. Life in the Whitmore household had settled into a rhythm, one where hospital visits had grown less frequent and laughter more common. And always at the center of it all was Shadow. Shadow, now nearly 2 years old, had grown into a strong, noble German shepherd. His fur had filled into a thick silver-gray coat, darker along his spine, and his gait carried both confidence and grace. Though he bore a faint scar on his left ear and a small patch of white fur where a wound had healed, his eyes, one amber, one cloudy blue, still held that same steady calm whenever he looked at Lila. To her, he was not just a dog. He was an anchor. The bond between them had only deepened with time. Shadow knew the sound of her coughs and the rhythm of her steps. He could sense her exhaustion before she admitted it and would press his body beside hers on the couch like a living blanket of comfort. Sarah, though still wary of allowing Lila too much strain, had grown used to seeing the two of them as a unit. Wherever Lila goes, Shadow follows, neighbors often said. And it was true. That spring, however, a routine visit to the local animal shelter for a community checkup program changed everything. The shelter was a modest building on the edge of town, run by a middle-aged couple, Tom and Darlene Murphy. Tom was a retired firefighter with a barrel chest, kind eyes, and an ever-present baseball cap that read, "Rescue First." Darlene, lean and wiry, had a voice like gravel and a soft spot for senior cats. Together, they ran the shelter with efficiency and a surprising amount of heart. Sarah had brought Shadow in that day to update his vaccination records before a planned camping trip with Lila. The clinic had recently joined a national pet database to prevent theft and streamline medical tracking, and part of the new policy involved scanning every dog for a microchip. "It's just routine," Tom said, holding the scanner casually as he knelt beside Shadow. "Probably won't even beep." But it did. A long, sustained beep followed by a sharp blinking red light. Tom's brow furrowed. "Huh? What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice tightening. "This chip is already registered. But not under your name." Within the hour, the calm of their world began to unravel. The chip traced back to a K-9 training facility in Wyoming, a state-run program that specialized in training German shepherds for search and rescue, narcotics detection, and law enforcement. The records indicated that the dog, registered under the name Ranger, had been reported stolen over 18 months ago during a transport accident. Sarah stood frozen as Tom handed her the printed form. Shadow, sensing tension, pressed himself against her legs and looked up with quiet worry. "Are you saying he was stolen?" she asked. "That's what the report says," Tom replied, carefully. "Whoever left him might have meant to sell him or just lost control. But legally, he doesn't belong to you." Sarah didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She thanked Tom, took the paper, and walked back to the car with Shadow trotting silently beside her. Lila was waiting on the porch when they returned, book in hand, cheeks flushed from the spring sun. When she saw her mother's face, she stood up, alarm flashing in her eyes. "What's wrong? Did something happen to Shadow?" Sarah hesitated. Then she sat beside her daughter on the steps and told her the truth. At first, Lila didn't speak. She just stared down at her hands, knuckles whitening as she clutched the hem of her shirt. Then came the storm, tears, disbelief, pleading. "They can't take him," she said through sobs. "They can't. He's not just a dog, he's mine. He's my Shadow." Sarah tried to explain. The law. The protocol. The chance that maybe, just maybe, the facility would allow them to keep him if he had been deemed unfit for duty. But the truth was, they had no say. Within 3 days, a representative from the Wyoming K-9 unit was scheduled to arrive and take Shadow back. The man who came on that third morning was Officer Nathan Corwin. He was tall and broad-shouldered, in his late 30s, with a buzzed haircut and a face that rarely betrayed emotion. He wore the official K-9 unit uniform, dark green with the agency crest, and carried a folder tucked under one arm. But his eyes softened when he met Lila. "I'm not here to take him away to punish anyone," he said gently. "If anything, I'm surprised he survived. We lost 3 dogs in that crash. Ranger, Shadow, as you call him, was one of the youngest. Everyone thought he was dead." Shadow stood behind Lila, ears slightly back, watching Officer Corwin with cautious stillness. "He's bonded to your daughter," Sarah said plainly. "He's more than a pet." "I believe that," Corwin replied. "But we still need to bring him in. He'll be evaluated, health, behavior, compatibility with active duty. If he's not a fit, there's a chance he'll be released from the program. If that happens, you'd be first on the list to adopt him formally." Lila stepped forward, her small frame rigid with defiance. "Do you promise to take care of him?" Corwin nodded. "I do." "Then tell him goodbye for me," she said, voice breaking. She knelt down, wrapped her arms around Shadow's neck, and pressed her forehead to his. "You'll come back to me." "I know it." Shadow licked her cheek once, slowly, then turned to Officer Corwin with reluctant obedience. He didn't resist the leash. But as he was led to the vehicle, he kept looking back, again and again, until the car pulled away, tires crunching on gravel, and disappeared down the winding road. That night, Lila didn't read aloud. The house was too quiet, too still. Even the wind through the trees seemed to hesitate, as if mourning a presence it had grown used to. But before she went to sleep, Lila pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote in large block letters, "I will find you. No matter where they take you. No matter how long it takes." She placed the note on the windowsill beside a photo of her and Shadow taken in the backyard, his head tilted, her face glowing with laughter, and whispered into the darkness, "We're not done." At 16, Lila Whitmore no longer wore her hair in ribbons or chased birds through pine trails. The girl who had once spent her childhood navigating hospital corridors with 4 poles and hope now stood taller, steadier, her once fragile frame strengthened by time, surgery, and something deeper, resolve. Her chest bore a faint scar beneath her collarbone, a reminder of the final procedure that had changed everything. The new heart valve beat with purpose, and Lila, in her quiet way, had vowed to live for something more than survival. She spent her weekends and summers volunteering at the Hope Trail Animal Rescue Center, nestled on the outskirts of Fort Collins. The facility, part sanctuary and part rehabilitation center, was run by a small but fiercely dedicated team. Its director, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s named Carla Dunn, was a former wildlife biologist with silver hair tied in a perpetual bun and deep laugh lines that contradicted her stern gaze. Carla treated every creature, human or animal, as a project worth redeeming, though she had little patience for excuses and less for cruelty. Lila first met Carla after she'd written a heartfelt letter asking to volunteer, detailing her connection with animals and her own history of healing. Carla, skeptical but intrigued, had invited her in for an interview. After 10 minutes, she handed Lila a pair of work gloves and said, "We'll see if your heart's strong enough to clean out raccoon dens." Since then, Lila had become a fixture at Hope Trail, feeding orphan fawns, scrubbing kennels, hand-taming feral kittens, and learning the subtle language of trauma in fur and feathers. She found peace there, and though she never spoke of it aloud, part of her was always searching. The search ended on a rainy Thursday afternoon in early October. The staff had gathered in the central office to review new animal intake files. Carla, seated at her desk littered with paper mugs and worn folders, was sorting through behavior reports when she paused at one particular entry. She tapped the photo staple to the corner, her expression unreadable. "Lila," she said, calling across the room. "Come take a look at this one." Lila wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the room. Carla handed her the sheet. It was a transfer request for a retired K-9 unit dog being held temporarily at the county shelter but deemed unsuitable for further service or adoption due to behavioral volatility. Dog's current name, Titan. Breed, German Shepherd. Age, approximately 6 years. Temperament, reactive, human avoidant, signs of past trauma. Multiple bite warnings. Evaluation recommendation, final reassessment pending. Likely unadoptable. Attached was a single photo. The dog's face was turned partially from the camera, but Lila didn't need a full profile. The scar down the left ear. The mismatched eyes. The silver-gray coat, now darker in patches, rough with time. Her hand tightened around the paper. Carla noticed immediately. "You know him." Lila nodded, slowly. Her voice barely reached above a whisper. "His name's not Titan. It's Shadow." Carla leaned back, folding her arms. "That's the one you told me about, years ago. The stray. The one they took." Lila swallowed. "He's not dangerous. He just got lost." The file said otherwise. Since returning to the K-9 program, Titan had passed physical reconditioning but failed all advanced temperament assessments. The trainers marked him as detached, with erratic signs of aggression and periods of deep withdrawal. He refused eye contact, didn't respond to basic commands unless under high duress, and had bitten 2 handlers during routine drills. The program had labeled him a broken bond. But Lila knew better. She spent the evening in the storage room, tears unspooling quietly as she stared at the photo until it blurred. Sarah found her there. Now in her late 40s, Sarah had grown more quietly protective over the years, her face sharper, her hair streaked with gray at the temples. She rarely raised her voice, but worry etched itself into her posture like permanent ink. "He's alive," Sarah said gently, brushing a hand through Lila's hair. "But he's not whole," Lila replied. "And they're going to put him down, Mom." Sarah crouched beside her. "Then what do you want to do?" Lila looked up. "Bring him home." Carla, ever the pragmatist, wasn't easily convinced. The next morning, she called in an old friend, Dr. Samuel Richter, a behavioral specialist who consulted with high-risk rescue cases. Dr. Richter was in his 70s, a retired military trainer with a calm voice and eyes like river stones, cool, watchful, and deep. He wore wool vests, moved slowly due to a limp from an old hiking injury, and believed in the long path over the quick fix. He met with Lila, reviewed her history with the dog, and read over the behavioral notes without comment. Finally, he said, "Bring him here. If there's anything left in him worth saving, we'll know within a day." Shadow arrived 2 days later in a reinforced transport crate. The handler from the county shelter, a young man named Julian with shaggy hair and a nervous laugh, warned them not to get too close. "He doesn't like people," Julian said, gripping the edge of the crate. "He's not like a dog anymore." Carla shot him a look. "Every animal is still an animal." Shadow didn't bark when the crate door opened. He stepped out slowly, eyes scanning the unfamiliar ground, body tense as a drawn wire. His fur was coarse, his ribs faintly visible under the coat, and his tail hung low. When Lila appeared across the yard, he froze. Their eyes met, her steady and trembling all at once, his unreadable. He didn't run to her. He didn't wag. He only stared, unmoving. "He doesn't remember me," Lila whispered. "Maybe," Dr. Richter said. "Or maybe he remembers too much." The next few days were a cautious dance. Shadow refused to enter the main shelter building and would only eat when Lila sat 10 feet away, facing the opposite direction. Carla assigned Lila a special schedule, early mornings and late evenings, when the center was quiet. Lila never spoke directly to him, only sat nearby and read aloud from the same books she used to read under the fireplace, her voice softer now, but filled with something that hadn't changed. On the 5th morning, as dew clung to the grass and the sun cracked over the ridges, Shadow approached. Not a leap, not a sprint, just a slow, wary walk until he was close enough to rest his chin on the toe of her boot. Lila stopped reading. Very carefully, she reached down, fingers hovering above his head. "Shadow," she whispered. The dog closed his eyes, leaned slightly into her touch, and let out a sigh, a long, low breath that sounded almost like surrender. Morning sunlight slanted through the high windows of Hope Trail's quarantine wing, striping the concrete floor in pale gold. The wing had once been a veterinary dormitory, but Carla Dunn had converted it into a behavioral observation unit, 3 connected rooms with reinforced glass partitions, remote-controlled doors, and acoustic dampening panels to soften echoes that could spook traumatized animals. Shadow, still listed as Titan in the intake ledger, occupied the center enclosure. He paced the perimeter with measured steps, tail low, mismatched eyes tracking every flicker of movement beyond the glass as though danger might seep through the seams of the building. Word of his arrival had reached Hope Trail's trustees, retired Judge Harriet Lowell, lanky and no-nonsense in charcoal slacks and pearl earrings, and Luis Contreras, a stout former park ranger whose laugh normally shook the rafters. Today both sat behind a metal desk, pens poised to record observations. Harriet's lined face was diplomatic but skeptical. Luis tapped his pen in soft staccato, more sympathetic yet bound by policy. They were here to decide if Shadow had potential for rehabilitation or if he would be transferred to a state facility where euthanasia remained an option. Lila stood in the adjoining room, separated from Shadow by the double-thick safety glass. She wore the beige volunteer smock over jeans, auburn hair pulled into a low braid, her surgical scar, faint under a V-neck tee, rose and fell with each deliberate breath. Dr. Samuel Richter, cane in hand, positioned himself near the intercom panel. No strangers to controlled introductions, they would let Lila speak, watch, document response, and be ready to intervene. Shadow halted when the inner door sealed with a muted hiss. He angled his head, ears pricked, as if sampling the air. The muscle ridge along his shoulders flexed, wary, not overtly aggressive. Lila swallowed. She carried no treats, no toys, only a dog-eared paperback of Jack London stories, its spine cracked from childhood use. She opened it to a familiar page. Her voice, though quiet, carried through the intercom with gentle clarity. He had been suddenly jerked from the heart of civilization and flung into the heart of things primordial. It was the same sentence she had whispered to a trembling pup 5 years earlier beside the fireplace. Now the words floated between glass and concrete. At first Shadow merely watched, nostrils fluttering. Harriet wrote, behavioral freeze. Eyes fixed. Tail neutral. Lila continued, letting Cadence do the work. She read a second paragraph, then lowered the book and gently spoke his true name. Shadow. A tremor coursed through the dog's frame, subtle, like wind rippling tall grass. He emitted a low, almost questioning whine, took a tentative step toward the glass, paused, then came closer until his breath condensed on the surface. Lila placed her palm against the partition. Shadow lifted one paw, hesitated, then pressed it to the opposite side, claws splayed for traction, mirroring her touch. The room hushed, even Luis's pen stopped tapping. Dr. Richter broke the silence with a whispered notation, recognition protocol stage 1 achieved, tactile mimicry. He flicked a glance at Harriet, who kept writing but the skepticism in her eyes faltered. To verify, Lila shifted 2 steps left. Shadow tracked her, sliding the single paw along the glass until their hands aligned again. She dared a half smile. It's me, boy. I kept my promise. The dog's ears melted backward in an expression Richter labeled soft engagement. A soft rumble rose from his chest, not a growl but a fragment of a long-forgotten sigh. Carla observed through CCTV from the corridor, arms folded across her forest green windbreaker. Beside her stood Maya Patel, Hope Trail's newest intern, 23, petite, with mocha skin and a waterfall of black curls tucked into a bun. Maya had joined only a month earlier after finishing a degree in animal behavior and still carried an analyst's notebook everywhere. She whispered to Carla, if he can relearn trust, he might qualify for the therapeutic pairing program with veterans. Carla grunted, non-committal, though hope flickered behind her stern eyes. Inside the enclosure, Lila took the next step in the script. She closed the book, set it on a shelf, and slowly sank to her knees, making herself smaller, non-threatening. Shadow mirrored again, lowering his body until chest and chin met the floor. 5 minutes passed in this tableau, girl and dog separated by inches and 5 years of unspoken history. The trustees conferred in low tones. Luis leaned forward, mustache twitching above an encouraging grin. We always say every animal deserves their chance, he murmured. Harriet tapped her notepad. Observation period is hardly definitive. But I can't deny empirical behavior. Richter asked permission to introduce the soft door test, a translucent panel that would slide aside, leaving only a mesh barrier wide enough for olfactory exchange but preventing full contact. Harriet nodded. Carla okayed it over the intercom. The mechanism hummed as the panel retracted. A rush of mixed scents, hay, disinfectant, the faint lavender of Lila's shampoo, flowed between them. Shadow's nose quivered. He inched forward until the mesh touched whiskers, then inhaled greedily, eyes half closing at the recognition of whatever memory lingered in her scent. Lila extended 2 fingers through the netting. Shadow didn't bite, instead he licked them once, dry, cautious, yet unmistakably gentle. A chorus of soft exhales filled the observation wing, tension drained like water finding its level. Dr. Richter straightened, leaning on his cane. Stage 2 successful. We suspend here. He pressed the button that signaled the mesh panel to close. Shadow didn't resist, he simply settled onto his haunches, watching Lila with a steadiness that spoke louder than any bark. Harriet rose, smoothing her blazer. Ms. Whitmore, your attachment is apparent. We must still weigh liability. Lila stood, voice steady but threaded with plea. He was never dangerous to begin with, only broken by losing everything familiar. Let us rebuild that familiarity. Luis cleared his throat. Proposal, a controlled rebonding schedule, 15-minute sessions, twice daily, decreasing barrier precautions incrementally as progress dictates. Carla raised an eyebrow. And if regression occurs? Luis shrugged. Then we adjust. But today we witnessed a spark. Harriet flipped her notebook shut. Very well. We will document this as provisional approval. She turned to Lila. You will be held to strict compliance, any violation and the decision reverses. Lila nodded, tears bright but unfallen. Understood. Later, while staff logged data and the trustees departed, Maya intercepted Lila in the hallway. She had kind, inquisitive eyes and spoke with quiet excitement. I'm compiling cortisol metrics on high-stress canines. Would you consent to pairing your sessions with data collection? It could strengthen the case to keep him here. Lila agreed instantly. Maya smiled, revealing a tiny dimple, and made a playful salute with her pen. Team Shadow, then. That evening, Sarah arrived to pick up her daughter. The late sun gilded her graying hair and deepened the worry lines around her dark eyes, but relief softened them when Lila recounted the day's events. Sarah hugged her, breath-catching. I always believed memory runs deeper than fear, she said. Lila pressed her cheek to her mother's shoulder. He remembered the story, Mom. Maybe he remembered the promise, too. In the dim kennel wing, long after volunteers had clocked out, Shadow lay on his mat, head resting on crossed paws. Outside, frogs began their night chorus and wind whispered through the cottonwoods lining the creek. Shadow's ears twitched at each sound, but his gaze stayed fixed on the glass where hours earlier a familiar voice had broken 5 years of silence. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since being tagged Titan, sleep arrived without nightmares. The days following Shadow's breakthrough were measured in small victories, tail wags that lasted longer, ears that perked when Lila entered, and, once, a soft bark that startled everyone in the building. Lila continued twice-daily sessions, now accompanied by Maya Patel, who sat quietly nearby, jotting down notes on stress levels and physiological cues. Shadow responded best to Jack London readings, peanut butter on her gloves, and the soft squeak of an old, tattered plush fox they found in storage. Though still guarded, his eyes had begun to lose the emptiness that haunted them on arrival. But just as hope began to bloom, something darker stirred beneath the surface of the rescue center. It started innocuously enough. One morning, Carla Dunn called Lila into her office. Carla, always composed, now appeared visibly strained, her windbreaker sleeves rolled up unevenly, reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. On her desk sat an envelope, unmarked, the kind used for legal documents. An inquiry came in about Shadow, Carla said, her voice low. A private party from Wyoming requesting a transfer. Claimed prior training experience with aggressive K9s, offered full payment to expedite adoption. Lila stiffened. But he's not cleared for adoption yet. That violates protocol. Carla nodded grimly. I turned them down immediately. But the strange thing is, the request came through a personal email, not the official system. Someone bypassed the application process. At that, Lila felt a flicker of unease. She left the office with a swirling mix of anger and dread. That evening, as the autumn wind howled through the cottonwoods outside, she called her best friend, Evan Clark. Evan had been Lila's neighbor since kindergarten, a wiry boy with thick glasses, quick wit, and an insatiable curiosity for all things tech. Now 17, Evan had grown into a lanky, hoodie-clad teenager with a mop of curly hair and the posture of someone who lived half his life behind a keyboard. Despite his sarcasm, Evan had a deeply loyal heart, especially when it came to Lila. So you're telling me someone's trying to buy Shadow illegally? He asked, seated in front of 3 glowing monitors in his cluttered attic bedroom. Posters of sci-fi movies and retro arcade games covered the slanted ceiling above him. Yes. And Carla thinks someone on the inside might be involved, Lila replied. Can you help me trace the email? Evan cracked his knuckles theatrically. Lila Whitmore, you've just summoned the wrath of a caffeine-fueled cyberjustice warrior. Within an hour, Evan had uncovered that the email had been routed through several IP masks but ultimately pinged back to a private account under the alias, TravisCo99. That alias was connected to a digital classified site known for selling retired service animals to high-paying clients without official clearance. This is a black market ring, Evan muttered, eyes scanning lines of code. They're using loopholes in the K9 retirement system to rehome dogs as unregulated personal security. It's like adopting an ex-Marine to guard your house, but without asking if he wants to. The deeper Evan dug, the darker the picture became. A handful of animals with similar behavior profiles to Shadow had disappeared from other shelters across Colorado and Utah over the past year. All paperwork claimed the dogs were either transferred or adopted, yet none were ever seen again in the public system. We need proof, Lila said. And fast. If they try again, Shadow won't stand a chance. Meanwhile, at Hope Trail, the atmosphere had shifted. Carla was more guarded, locking all animal files behind encrypted drives. Maya noticed 2 unfamiliar men lingering near the front gate during her evening shift, pretending to ask about volunteer opportunities. When she described them to Carla, short, stocky build, one with a sleeve tattoo of a wolf's head, Carla tightened her jaw and notified the sheriff's office. But with no direct evidence, the men left untouched. Lila decided they needed a plan, a way to safeguard Shadow without tipping off the wrong people. Working with Evan, Maya, and Carla, they initiated Project Echo. Under Project Echo, Shadow was officially listed in the center's system as under medical quarantine. This removed his name from the public adoption roster. He was relocated from the main kennel wing to a secure enclosure inside the storage barn, hidden behind stacks of hay and soundproofed insulation. Maya coded a secondary identity file under the name Boulder, linked to an entirely different intake case number. Sarah, Lila's mother, was informed late one night after her ER shift. Still in her navy scrubs, she listened carefully at the kitchen table, mug of decaf coffee steaming in her hands. Though exhausted, her expression hardened with maternal resolve. "If someone lays a hand on that dog again," Sarah said, "they'll answer to me first." Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years watching her daughter fight for breath, then watched her fight for something to live for. 2 weeks passed. The plan held. Shadow began to relax again, though the staff remained on edge. On a windy Tuesday morning, Evan called Lila in a panic. "They posted again," he said, sending her a screenshot. It was a photo, grainy but unmistakable, of Shadow, taken from a distance through the mesh gate, captioned, "Elite K9, silent on command, available soon. Serious buyers only." The post had already received over 40 messages. Carla called in Sheriff Boyd Travers, a tall, weathered man with crow's feet deep as canyon lines and a voice like gravel. A friend of Carla's from her fieldwork days, he had retired twice and come back twice. After hearing the story, Boyd promised to escalate the issue to state investigators. "Smells like organized trade," he muttered, eyeing the photo. "They want animals trained by love and loyalty, not force. Makes them harder to trace when things go sideways." That night, Lila sat in the barn beside Shadow, her knees pulled to her chest, the plush fox toy resting between them. She read aloud without thinking, just letting her voice fill the shadows. Shadow lay still at first, then crept closer, curling beside her with a sigh. She rested her hand on his head. "They won't take you again," she whispered. "Not while I have breath in me." And outside, where no one could see, the wolf-tattooed man sat in a parked truck half a block from Hope Trail, watching the barn through binoculars. The wind rolled over the hills like a restless tide that night, tugging at the tin roofs of barns and rattling the bare branches outside Hope Trail's perimeter fence. The temperature had dropped sharply since sunset, and a storm had begun to churn above the mountains, thunder grumbling, lightning flashing like silent warnings. Inside the barn, Shadow lay curled beside a bale of straw, eyes half open, ears twitching with every distant boom. His coat had thickened for winter, but the scar across his flank, a jagged line from an old training injury, shimmered under the soft light of the overhead bulb. Lila hadn't planned to be at the center that night. She'd come back late to retrieve her reading journal, forgotten in the observation room. Dressed in an oversized raincoat and rain-slicked boots, she had driven through sheets of water, telling herself it would take 5 minutes, 10 at most. But she stayed longer. Something in her gut, intuition or memory, told her not to leave just yet. Maya Patel, having volunteered for night watch, was home with a cold. Carla had insisted she rest, and Sheriff Boyd Travers had planned another sweep of the grounds the next morning. The cameras were running, the gates locked. Everything seemed still. Until the power cut out. It was subtle at first, just a flicker, as if the storm had swatted the grid with a careless hand. Then the lights died completely, plunging the barn and kennels into near blackness. Emergency backup lighting kicked in after a few seconds, red and dim, designed to guide rather than illuminate. Lila froze in the central corridor, the sound of rain on the roof growing louder in the silence. From her left came the low, unsettled growl of a dog. Shadow. She turned quickly and hurried down the row, whispering, "It's okay, boy. Just the storm. I'm here." But Shadow wasn't looking at her. His body was rigid, hackles raised, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the barn door. He gave one bark, sharp, warning, and then another. And that was when Lila heard the click. A soft, metallic sound, barely audible, like the cocking of a latch or the slide of a tool across wire fencing. Before she could process it, the side door slammed open with the wind, and 2 figures stepped in, silhouettes outlined by flashes of lightning. Both wore dark hooded jackets, heavy boots, and gloves. One carried a long duffel bag. The other, shorter and stockier, held a tranquilizer gun. Lila ducked instinctively behind a storage cabinet, heart hammering. Her phone was in her car. She peeked out just in time to see the taller figure heading straight for the far kennels, where the two other dogs, Rocky and Belle, were kept. "They're here," whispered the shorter man. "Shadow's supposed to be behind that tarp." "What about the girl?" the taller one asked, noticing Lila's shadow too late. In a rush of adrenaline, Lila bolted toward Shadow's enclosure, fingers fumbling with the manual lock. "Come on," she whispered, "please." Shadow surged to his feet, sensing her fear, and the second the latch released, he barreled forward, not at her, but past her, eyes blazing with something primal. The stocky man raised his weapon too slow. Shadow lunged with the precision of a retired K9, his body crashing into the attacker's legs and sending him sprawling backward into a stack of crates. The tranq gun fired harmlessly into the ceiling. The taller intruder yanked a stun baton from his coat and advanced toward Lila. She backed up into a feed barrel, breath caught in her throat. Lightning illuminated the barn once more, revealing his covered face, the flash of a knife in his belt. But he never reached her. Shadow was faster. With a low, guttural snarl, he launched again, this time straight into the man's chest. They hit the ground hard. The man howled as Shadow bit deep into the padding of his jacket, teeth inches from flesh. He tried to push the dog away, but Shadow growled louder, a sound that wasn't just protection, it was recognition. This was the man from the car. The one who had watched them through binoculars. At the edge of the chaos, Lila managed to slam her hand on the emergency alarm button. A shrill wail filled the building. Within minutes, the local sheriff's unit, still on patrol for storm safety, arrived, lights flashing through the storm-drenched road. The scene that met them was unforgettable, two intruders disarmed and pinned, one by a 90-pound German shepherd who refused to release until Lila gave a single word, "Down." It took hours to process everything. Maya arrived shivering in her coat, eyes wide in disbelief. Sheriff Boyd personally collected the hard drives from the security cameras, which had recorded the entire incident. The footage, even in grainy red light, told the story with stark clarity: an attempted theft, a coordinated plan to steal trained dogs, and a single dog's choice to stand between the darkness and the girl who once read him books beneath a blanket of stars. In the days that followed, investigators uncovered the rest of the ring: names, aliases, transactions, even encrypted chats detailing Shadow's location and behavior logs. Carla, usually stoic, hugged Lila and sobbed softly into her shoulder. "He remembered who he is," she whispered. "Not just your dog. But a guardian." Sarah arrived at the center shortly after, her face pale and drawn from the ER but alive with quiet fury. She held Lila close for what felt like hours. "I should have never let you come alone," she said, though Lila only replied, "He saved me, Mom. We saved each other." On the fourth day, a letter arrived, official, stamped with the seal of the Colorado Division of Animal Welfare. It stated, in careful legal language, that due to Shadow's demonstrated bravery, loyalty, and protective behavior, the board had voted unanimously to approve his return to the Whitmore family. When Lila read the words aloud to him, Shadow nuzzled her hand, then rested his head against her chest, as if the weight of 5 years could finally be set down. The wind rolled over the hills like a restless tide that night, tugging at the tin roofs of barns and rattling the bare branches outside Hope Trail's perimeter fence. The temperature had dropped sharply since sunset, and a storm had begun to churn above the mountains, thunder grumbling, lightning flashing like silent warnings. Inside the barn, Shadow lay curled beside a bale of straw, eyes half open, ears twitching with every distant boom. His coat had thickened for winter, but the scar across his flank, a jagged line from an old training injury, shimmered under the soft light of the overhead bulb. Lila hadn't planned to be at the center that night. She'd come back late to retrieve her reading journal, forgotten in the observation room. Dressed in an oversized raincoat and rain-slicked boots, she had driven through sheets of water, telling herself it would take 5 minutes, 10 at most. But she stayed longer. Something in her gut, intuition or memory, told her not to leave just yet. Maya Patel, having volunteered for night watch, was home with a cold. Carla had insisted she rest, and Sheriff Boyd Travers had planned another sweep of the grounds the next morning. The cameras were running, the gates locked. Everything seemed still. Until the power cut out. It was subtle at first, just a flicker, as if the storm had swatted the grid with a careless hand. Then the lights died completely, plunging the barn and kennels into near blackness. Emergency backup lighting kicked in after a few seconds, red and dim, designed to guide rather than illuminate. Lila froze in the central corridor, the sound of rain on the roof growing louder in the silence. From her left came the low, unsettled growl of a dog. Shadow. She turned quickly and hurried down the row, whispering, "It's okay, boy. Just the storm. I'm here." But Shadow wasn't looking at her. His body was rigid, hackles raised, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the barn door. He gave one bark, sharp, warning, and then another. And that was when Lila heard the click. A soft, metallic sound, barely audible, like the cocking of a latch or the slide of a tool across wire fencing. Before she could process it, the side door slammed open with the wind, and two figures stepped in, silhouettes outlined by flashes of lightning. Both wore dark hooded jackets, heavy boots, and gloves. One carried a long duffel bag. The other, shorter and stockier, held a tranquilizer gun. Lila ducked instinctively behind a storage cabinet, heart hammering. Her phone was in her car. She peeked out just in time to see the taller figure heading straight for the far kennels, where the two other dogs, Rocky and Belle, were kept. "They're here," whispered the shorter man. "Shadow's supposed to be behind that tarp." "What about the girl?" the taller one asked, noticing Lila's shadow too late. In a rush of adrenaline, Lila bolted toward Shadow's enclosure, fingers fumbling with the manual lock. "Come on," she whispered, "please." Shadow surged to his feet, sensing her fear, and the second the latch released, he barreled forward, not at her, but past her, eyes blazing with something primal. The stocky man raised his weapon too slow. Shadow lunged with the precision of a retired K9, his body crashing into the attacker's legs and sending him sprawling backward into a stack of crates. The tranq gun fired harmlessly into the ceiling. The taller intruder yanked a stun baton from his coat and advanced toward Lila. She backed up into a feed barrel, breath caught in her throat. Lightning illuminated the barn once more, revealing his covered face, the flash of a knife in his belt. But he never reached her. Shadow was faster. With a low, guttural snarl, he launched again, this time straight into the man's chest. They hit the ground hard. The man howled as Shadow bit deep into the padding of his jacket, teeth inches from flesh. He tried to push the dog away, but Shadow growled louder, a sound that wasn't just protection, it was recognition. This was the man from the car. The one who had watched them through binoculars. At the edge of the chaos, Lila managed to slam her hand on the emergency alarm button. A shrill wail filled the building. Within minutes, the local sheriff's unit, still on patrol for storm safety, arrived, lights flashing through the storm-drenched road. The scene that met them was unforgettable, two intruders disarmed and pinned, one by a 90-pound German shepherd who refused to release until Lila gave a single word, "Down." It took hours to process everything. Maya arrived shivering in her coat, eyes wide in disbelief. Sheriff Boyd personally collected the hard drives from the security cameras, which had recorded the entire incident. The footage, even in grainy red light, told the story with stark clarity: an attempted theft, a coordinated plan to steal trained dogs, and a single dog's choice to stand between the darkness and the girl who once read him books beneath a blanket of stars. In the days that followed, investigators uncovered the rest of the ring: names, aliases, transactions, even encrypted chats detailing Shadow's location and behavior logs. Carla, usually stoic, hugged Lila and sobbed softly into her shoulder. He remembered who he is, she whispered. Not just your dog. But a guardian. Sarah arrived at the center shortly after, her face pale and drawn from the ER but alive with quiet fury. She held Lila close for what felt like hours. I should have never let you come alone, she said, though Lila only replied, he saved me, Mom. We saved each other. On the fourth day, a letter arrived, official, stamped with the seal of the Colorado Division of Animal Welfare. It stated, in careful legal language, that due to Shadow's demonstrated bravery, loyalty, and protective behavior, the board had voted unanimously to approve his return to the Whitmore family. When Lila read the words aloud to him, Shadow nuzzled her hand, then rested his head against her chest, as if the weight of 5 years could finally be set down. In the end, Shadow didn't need words to prove his love, and Lila didn't need a perfect heart to keep one beating beside hers. Sometimes, what heals us isn't medicine, but memory, loyalty, and the quiet presence of someone who stays. In your own life, maybe there's someone, or something, you once lost, but never stopped loving. And maybe, like Lila and Shadow, that bond is still waiting for its second chance. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes in the power of connection, and subscribe so you won't miss the stories still to come.